So this week we are going to go through job analysis in chapter 10. Hopefully you all have seen some job analysis before in other HR management classes, but we'll review it again here. We'll get into details in different ways that you can do job analysis. And then after this chapter in coming weeks, we'll actually use job analysis information to start doing a job evaluation next week and then sort of basing our compensation system or the decisions we'll make around that system on our job analysis and job evaluation. So job analysis is just the activities that you do to systematically, meaning that you have some kind of organized way of obtaining, categorizing, and documenting all the relevant information about a specific job. The systematically is really important in job analysis because in a couple of slides, I'll show some of the purposes for job analysis. And in order to meet those purposes, especially with compliance, we need the same kind of information about all the different kinds of jobs or positions that we have within our organization. So the purpose is simply to gather that data for a lot of specific HR functions. In this class, we'll mostly focus on job analysis for job evaluation and compliance with compensation laws. But there are many other uses for job analysis, which is why a lot of organizations still do this process. A lot of organizations, we talked about in earlier weeks, will use external data to find out what market prices are for compensation. Even if they do that, they may still do job analysis on at least some jobs within the organization for all of these other reasons that you need job analysis in the HR functions. So for recruitment, selection, and placement, we have to have job descriptions that help people identify whether they're qualified for the job, so they can apply for it, so we can recruit them. And on our end, for as HR supervisors or managers or generalists or specialists, as well as the managers who might be hiring these individuals, we can use that job description to figure out if people meet the job specifications, so the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed for the job, as well as whether that person can meet the essential functions of the job if needed. We also use job analysis to organize the planning and job design within the organization. So, for example, which jobs are going to be in which kinds of departments, who will oversee those departments, that sort of thing. We also use job analysis and training and development to determine if there are people who are missing some of the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the jobs. If Especially because we should be doing job analysis regularly, at least every year, every few years on a schedule. As the jobs are changing because of technology and just changes in the industry, is there training and development we need to give our current employees to match the new tasks or elements of the job that we discover in the job analysis as we redo them? We can also use job analysis and grievance settlements to set kind of a baseline of what were the expectations for this job. So you use the job analysis to determine what were the tasks in this job, what skill level do you need to do those tasks, what does a successful performance of those tasks look like, which is based off of the job analysis, but is not necessarily part of the job analysis initially. So that's really useful. And that's kind of the same with regulatory compliance on the very bottom here. We have to use the task level or sometimes even other elements of that job analysis to determine, for example, with equal pay, the Equal Pay Act, do we have jobs that are similar enough they should be paid similarly, regardless of whether men or women are predominantly taking those jobs? And with the Americans with Disabilities Act, that compliance comes into those essential job functions. Is that listed? Can we determine what those are in job analysis? And then are those listed in the job description we write from that job analysis? And then in this class, we'll mostly focus as well on job evaluation and compensation programs in the coming weeks. There are a lot of different approaches to job analysis, and if any of you have ever been involved with this at work or in an internship, you'll notice that different organizations may do different things. The most common, or at least traditionally the most common, was work-oriented analysis, where you look at the work that is done in the organization. So this is really like the tasks and the grouping of those tasks into a job. But especially with knowledge capital or knowledge jobs in the knowledge economy, sorry, we often focus on worker-oriented analysis because we need the knowledge, skills, and abilities that can adapt to changes in the tasks that will need to be done for this job, especially as either technology is introduced into that job or as the industry changes and the work itself changes very quickly. We can also do a context-oriented analysis, and that includes trying to figure out like where do people do this work? What kinds of tools or resources are they using? What kinds of technology do they use? That sort of thing. We can use all three of these approaches in a job analysis and in different ways, but the emphasis might be different depending on which method or which framework you're using, which I'll introduce in the next video. We can also use inductive or deductive approaches. An inductive approach, you're taking the information from the jobs that you have and you're we call it inducing, but you are figuring out what that job looks like so that you're doing the job analysis from the job itself. Deductive, you can do this with new jobs, but also you can do with this with an idea of what you want jobs to look like. So you have an idea, and then you start creating the job analysis around a job, regardless of the tasks that are in that job currently, to meet whatever that kind of idea or template you have in your head is for that particular job. This can be particularly helpful, a deductive approach, if you're going to use like benchmark analysis, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, where you need to be able to compare a job in your organization to a job outside of your organization. If you have the opportunity to shape that job into something that looks like jobs in other companies and other organizations in your industry, that can be very helpful. And then we can also use the Department of Labor job analysis formula to think about what is the information we need in a job analysis. So we need to know what people do. So what are the tasks? That would be that work-oriented analysis. How do they do them? Why do they do them? And then what skills are needed to do those jobs? So the how and why might include some of the context, and the skill includes that worker-oriented analysis. We have a lot of levels of analysis as well. This goes from very specific to broader or more general. The more specific you are, the more time, energy, resources you're going to have to put into your job analysis. So the first level is employee attributes. This is a very common level of analysis, especially for jobs that are in the knowledge economy where people's knowledge, skills, and abilities are sort of key to doing that job, where it can be really hard, for example, to train an employee to do that job. They need to have that sort of training or knowledge coming into the workplace. The next sort of level up would be elements. This is not a level you will likely ever have to work with. This is something more like industrial engineers would work with. So an example of elements might be you might have something you have to do as part of your job. So how are you using a computer to do that? How are you using a keyboard or a mouse? You can think about like ergonomic studies as being studies that are really about that element level. That's why industrial engineers and others who are kind of particular about the motions that people are doing in their jobs and that sort of thing would use that element level. But HR, we usually don't. It's a little too small for us sometimes. But we use tasks a lot as well in the job analysis as a level of analysis. And I would say this is probably the most common level in the sense of describing what a job or what are the tasks of a job. What does the job do? And this is literally breaking up all the tasks that a job does and then writing them down. And I'll show you how to do that using ONET a little bit later in the second video. We also have positions. This is those job descriptions that we'll end up writing. These are the specific positions we have in our organization that are related to the groupings of tasks that we put together in that position. Jobs are positions that are very similar, but they could be across the organization. So you might have a position, a person fulfills a position, but there may be many people who have those positions and they're working in a job. And then jobs across organizations are grouped into occupations so that you can compare a job in this organization with a similar job in another organization. An example of this might be if we wanted to say a position was like industrial engineer level 1. This might be an entry-level industrial engineer job where someone who just got a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering takes that job. That's a position. The jobs themselves might be industrial engineering jobs. Maybe they're in their same department. They might be scattered across an organization depending on how that organization is organized. So those jobs could be at that same level, or they could have a few different levels for people who are in the industrial engineering jobs. Like if you're in an engineering company, for example, you'll probably have different levels, and the jobs will be based on those different kinds of engineering that you might have in that firm. Occupations then would be industrial engineer, which would be an occupation that you can find jobs across different kinds of companies. They could be engineering companies, but they could also be companies in other industries that happen to have industrial engineers as part of the work that they do in that organization. And then job families are much broader. So something like engineering would be a job family where you'll have industrial engineers, but you might have other engineers like mechanical engineers or civil engineers who are part of that engineering job family. You can collect a lot of different information We generally have to collect person-job relationships because we need to know the specifications for the job. What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that people need to do these jobs? Um, that usually involves job activities. So, what are the physical, mental, and interactional things, tasks that people are doing? So, physically, what are they doing? Mentally, do they have to do calculations? Are they using their knowledge and skills in a specific way mentally? And then, are they interacting with certain people? Are they overseeing some employees? Are they working in teams and groups? Do they have to work with clients and customers? That sort of thing. The organization job relationship is important, especially when we get to the job description, because it helps people understand what are the resources available to do this job, but what constraints are also part of that job. What are the limitations in terms of those resources or in terms of the policies and procedures that you have to follow? In that job. That can be different from organization to organization, but that also then sets different expectations for that job, just depending on how many resources you have, but also how many constraints are put upon you in doing that job. Job outcomes are also very important. Some jobs you can actually, you're producing a product or service and you can name that as part of the job itself in job analysis. It's also very possible and very likely that a lot of jobs they'll be doing part of a product or service, but they don't fully create that product or service, in which case you need to specify what part of the product or service they create. And then you also want to mention the job rewards. In our class, we're going to really focus on these extrinsic rewards. So things like the benefits, pay, potential pay increases, and that sort of thing. But there might be intrinsic rewards as well. For example, if we have scientists or engineers working in a firm, we may have a career ladder for them. So an intrinsic reward might be developing their skill as an engineer, their knowledge as an engineer, perhaps their certifications that they can get that will show that they have gained knowledge and experience over their careers. Those things can be intrinsically rewarding to people. You may also want to mention the kinds of interesting work or the kinds of opportunities that might be available in this kind of position based on the changes that are happening, because sometimes that's also very intrinsically rewarding for people, especially people who've done a lot of training or had a lot of experience in a job coming into an organization. We also use a lot of methods for collecting the job information. A very common kind in a job that in jobs or positions that are already established is interviews. Generally in HR, we recommend structured interviews, especially if since we need to get very systematic information across the different kinds of positions or jobs that we have within an organization. So to make sure that you're collecting that same information, you want a structured interview guide where you have specific questions you ask everyone. You can ask follow-up questions that are different or specific to each position or job that you're researching, in which case then that's where you get kind of the nuances across different kinds of jobs. You could use unstructured interviews if, for example, you are in a startup and you have a founder or founding team and they have an idea of what kinds of jobs they want, but they haven't quite specified what those are, and that's sort of what the job analysis is for. In that case, an unstructured interview might be helpful in figuring out what they want and then using that information to structure the first jobs that you create within that organization or the job analysis in that organization. And then after that, making sure that you're getting that systematic information across those jobs to write job descriptions that are comparable then. For jobs that already exist, you might do an observation. Observations do take a long time, and that will be part of your assignment this week instead of the quiz that we usually do. But observation can be very helpful because there may be things that if you interview someone, they don't think about in their job, or it's just such an everyday occurrence in their job that they don't think of it as a special thing to mention to you if you're doing the job analysis as an HR employee. And so observing them to see how they use equipment, how they work in teams, what kinds of things are they doing mentally during the day, for example, would be really helpful. Observation is easiest for jobs where you can see what people are doing. So things like manufacturing where people are working with their hands. It may also be somewhat easy if you can sit in on meetings when people have to work in teams. The hardest kinds of jobs to observe are knowledge jobs where people are using a lot of the knowledge, skills, and abilities in their heads, and they're maybe working on a computer. That's where, when you're observing, you often have to stop people and ask what they're doing or why they're doing it, which can interrupt them while they're doing that job. We also use group-based techniques. I would say this is actually very common in a lot of workplaces, whether the job has existed already in that organization for some time or if you're creating new jobs. And this is where you might ask people like employees who would work in that job or potentially related to that job if it doesn't exist yet, supervisors who supervise people in those jobs or could be supervising a person in a new job that you're creating, experts in that area, professionals within your industry that know know about these jobs, that sort of thing. Group-based techniques can be really helpful because you get a lot of different opinions about what that job should look like. You can also get different ideas of what that job, how that job could be different from either other jobs or jobs that are in other organizations. Questionnaires can be very popular as well. They can be paper or computer based. You have to think about whether you want to use paper or computer based on what resources people have for the jobs that they're using. For example, if you are going to use a questionnaire for all the staff in the College of Business, for example, a computer-based questionnaire would work for most employees in the College of Business because most of us do use computers as part of our everyday jobs. But we have maintenance staff, for example, that work in the building. They don't have computers for work, and so they would need a paper-based questionnaire if we wanted to ask them. We can use organizational records and documentation, whether that job is new or has existed for some time, to either get a sense of the history of the kinds of jobs or related jobs that have existed in that organization if it's a new job, or to get a sense of how this job has changed over time. You also can use documentation, especially in HR, with the policies and procedures that may affect how that job is done or what resources or constraints might be, I don't want to say hindering, but are affecting the way that people would do that job. You can also do a literature review, either in the literature around that job or in industry magazines and that sort of thing. For example, in HR, we can use the Society for Human Resource Management for some of our literature review, especially for jobs in HR and some management jobs. There also may be information on SHRM's website about other kinds of jobs. And so the sources of information for all of those different techniques that you would use could be people who already have the job, people who supervise people doing that job, technical experts. And when I say technical experts, it can also include people like professors at the university who train students to go into those jobs. They may have some expertise about what those jobs should look like. Colleagues and stakeholders who work with those jobs or who depend on those jobs for something that they need in their job or outside of their job. A stakeholder could be someone in the community, for example, that depends on someone in an organization doing something. Job analysts, these are actual professionals who do job analysis and then organizational records.